Commodity production is thrown around in communist circles in fanatical amounts. In the debates surrounding it, usually two sides emerge. Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, and similar tendencies argue, usually citing Joseph Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR, that commodity production, and hence the law of value too, operated in all socialist states and will operate in the future ones as well, for the simple fact that socialism, or the lower stage of communism, still maintains all of the aforementioned until a full transition has been made into the higher stage, or communism proper. These tendencies mostly use out-of-context passages from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, repeating birthmarks of capitalism ad nauseum. The second side, which usually involves left communists and other anti-Stalinists, argue that developed commodity production is a strictly capitalist characteristic and that it represents a capitalist remnant in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hakim's recent video, Does Commodity Production Exist Under Socialism?, prompted me to make a YouTube channel and write about this topic. I will be exploring the mistakes made in that video and talk about the subject in a broader sense, while referring to a vast collection of Marxists and their works. Together, we will try to determine the exact meaning of commodity production in greater depth, as well as probe into how it emerged, which is precisely the main aim of this video. I don't want any of this to be one of those cliché, overdone discussions with no fruitfulness, so I will devote my entire time to intellectual honesty and open-mindedness. My only goal is to convey complicated information in a flexible manner in the hopes of not only convincing you that commodity production does not belong in any socialist formation, but also giving you some food for thought beyond any disagreements. The sources and the quotes, of which there will be a lot, and I apologize in advance for it might get a little boring at times, will be displayed on the screen for a more comfortable viewing experience. Some of the quotes I've left in their original form for context, which makes them a little bit long. There can be mucho texto memes made about this, but it is in your best interest that I provide the full extract without any ellipses or cuts. Even though I will be adding my own commentary, summaries and clarifications, most of the quotes are pretty much self-explanatory and very clear, hence we won't need to devote much time to explaining all of them in depth besides maybe a paragraph or two. I want this video to be a response, and I will try to keep it on topic and as concise as possible, but only a portion of this video is an actual direct response to some of the fallacious points made in the aforementioned video. I will explore around a bit an actual history of how these theories emerged too, so you might want to buckle up. Also, before I start, a little clarification. First, I am not a left communist, so I will not be presenting specifically left communist positions throughout the whole video. And second, Luxembourgism is not a thing. I chose this channel name because it replicates my Twitter username. I like to think that I'm just a Marxist. Alright, without further ado, enjoy. To even begin talking about commodity production, we must first define what a commodity is, as well as explore the concept of production, synthesizing the two for our exposition of commodity production in general. According to Marx, a commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies a human want of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. Hakim very correctly cites Lenin's Karl Marx's economic doctrine, who in turn reiterates this point of Marx. Quote, a commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. End quote. Alright, so far so good. It seems perfectly obvious what a commodity is, and by observing Marx's Capital, as the book starts with exploring the concept of commodities itself, it is clear that commodities take a central part in our analysis. So much so, that Marx himself identifies the commodity as the cell of capitalist society. Moving on to production, we must once again cite Marx. Quote, whether we speak of production then, what is meant is always production at a definite stage of social development, production by social individuals. Production in general is an abstraction, but a rational abstraction insofar as it really brings out and fixes the common element and thus saves us repetition. Capital is, among other things, also an instrument of production, also objectified, past labor. If there is no production in general, then there is no general production. Production is always a particular branch of production, for example agriculture, cattle raising, manufacturers, and so on, or it is a totality. End quote. Now that we have understood the concept of the commodity end of production, we must combine the two and see what commodity production really is. Friedrich Engels, writing in Chapter 9 of The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, explains the genesis of commodity production and what it entails. Quote, with the splitting up of production into two great main branches, agriculture and handicrafts, arises production directly for exchange, commodity production. Civilization is, therefore, the stage of development in society at which the division of labor, the exchange between individuals arising from it, and the commodity production which combines them both, come to their full growth and revolutionizes the whole of previous society. The division of labor slowly insinuates itself into this process of production. It undermines the collectivity of production and appropriation, elevates appropriation by individuals into the general rule, and thus creates exchange between individuals. Gradually, commodity production becomes the dominating form. End quote. Engels makes clear that the starting point of commodity production, which he defines as, quote, production directly for exchange, end quote, was a division of production into agriculture and handicrafts. According to his definition, commodity production combines the division of labor and the exchange between individuals arising from it. This is a monumental claim and will help us later immensely when trying to deconstruct why a socialist society cannot physically have commodity production. In this passage, and especially in the ones following it, to which we'll soon come, we also see Engels starting to hit at the concept of alienation, something that a portion of this video will be dedicated to. He continues, quote, with commodity production no longer for use by the producers but for exchange, the products necessarily change hands. In exchanging his product, the producer surrenders it. He no longer knows what becomes of it. When money, and with money the merchant, steps in as intermediary between the producers, the process of exchange becomes still more complicated, the final fate of the product still more uncertain. The merchants are numerous, and none of them knows what the other is doing. The commodities already pass not only from hand to hand, they also pass from market to market. The producers have lost control over the total production within their own spheres, and the merchants have not gained it. Products and production become subjects of chance. End quote. This passage is of utmost importance to us, and contains a valuable contribution in explaining how estrangement develops and works. Engels explains that with commodity production, which contains the division of labor, so now here we see already a clear chain forming when one condition existing must necessarily be followed by another. The producer surrenders the products by exchanging it, thereby losing track of its fate. As the world develops, the scale increases. Merchants, more markets, and intercontinental trade enter the scene, only to serve as a stepping stone for the most profound form of alienation, which is wage labor. Production as a process, and its vassals, the products themselves, become subjected to chance. To explain why this is important, Engels goes on to say, quote, but chance is only the one pole of a relation whose other pole is named necessity. The more a social activity, a series of social processes, becomes too powerful for men to consciously control and it grows above their heads, and the more it appears a matter of pure chance. Then, all the more surely, within this chance the laws peculiar to it and inherent in it assert themselves as if by natural necessity. Such laws also govern the chances of commodity production and exchange. To the individuals producing or exchanging, they appear as alien. At first, often unrecognized powers, whose nature must first be laboriously investigated and established. These economic laws of commodity production are modified with the various stages of this form of production. But, in general, the whole period of civilization is dominated by them. And still to this day, the product rules the producer. End quote. The two parts of this extract which we have emphasized are key to understanding the nature of commodity production and how alienation is in connection with it. Engels states that the economic laws of commodity production, quote, are modified with the various stages of this form, which is the commodity form, of production, end quote, which implies that whether it is simple or capitalist commodity production, the laws governing them are modified, but never abolished, and the, quote, whole period of civilization is dominated by them, end quote. Engels remarks later in the book that, quote, since civilization is founded on the exploitation of one class by another class, its whole development proceeds in a constant contradiction, end quote. This signifies to us that in communism, regardless of the stage, civilization as a concept is transcended, as there are no longer classes. And as Engels states in chapter 9, the whole period of civilization is dominated by the economic laws, meaning that they are exploitative by their nature, leading to their abolition in a classless society. We would need an entirely different video and a much longer one explaining if socialism, i.e., the lower stage of communism, has a state, and hence classes. But there can be convincing arguments made as to why or why not a state is necessary in the lower stage, and even quotes from Lenin's The State and Revolution can justify any of the former views. But this is a topic much more controversial and detailed than commodity production, so we shall leave it aside for now. Of course, for Marxist-Leninists who believe that the state does indeed exist in the lower stage, and hence classes too, they will naturally consider this epoch a part of civilization. But Engels, who used communism and socialism interchangeably, doesn't talk about stages at all, but rather, he takes communism, as in the communist mode of production, which has to be existent in both the lower phase and the higher phase, to be outside of civilization, and hence free from classes. So regardless of what Marxist-Leninists may opine on the state, Engels tells us that socialism exists outside of civilization, the latter implying class, state, bureaucracy, and exploitation. Now that the history of commodity production in general is clear, it's time to explain the technicalities, and here's where Marx comes in. We'll go through the relevant passages from all 4 volumes of Capital, starting by Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1. Quote, "In the totality of various use values or commodity incarnations, there appears a totality of varying deployments of useful labor, just as manifold and differing in genus, species, family, subspecies, variety, a social division of labor. This is the precondition for the existence of commodity production, and it is not the case that commodity production is the precondition for the existence of a social division of labor. In the community of ancient India, labor is socially divided without the products becoming commodities." End quote. Marx makes clear that if commodity production exists, so does the social division of labor, and not the other way around. He takes ancient India as an example where the social division of labor did indeed exist, but the products weren't commodified. However, there isn't a single instance where commodity production has existed without the social division of labor. Ergo, where commodity production exists, so must the social division of labor. Here, we get a glimpse of why commodity production is problematic. It necessitates the existence of social division of labor, which comes with the problems of its own, which we shall deal with later on. Marx had highlighted all of this in the draft of Chapter 6 of Capital previously. The quote I am about to read is much more important than the one in the finalized version of Capital, as it underlines several major points we're trying to make. Quote, "Commodity production necessarily leads to capitalist production once the worker has ceased to be a part of the conditions of production, slavery, serfdom, or the naturally evolved community no longer remains the basis of production, India, from the moment at which labor power itself in general becomes a commodity. Capitalist production annihilates the original basis of commodity production. Isolated, independent production and exchange between the owners of commodities, or the exchange of equivalents, the exchange between capital and labor becomes formal." End quote. Here, Marx makes the same point, albeit with a bit more nuance which is rather important to us. He makes clear that utilization of commodity production in a socialist society by stripping it of its capitalist nature and regressing it to its pre-capitalist form is simply impossible. However, this is what some Marxist-Leninists suggest and imply when they make the point that capitalism is not the same as commodity production over and over again. Of course, in this latter regard, they are absolutely right. Every prominent Marxist is seen making the same point, including Marx. An example of this is Chapter 4 of Capital Volume 2, where he says, quote, "But it is the tendency of the capitalist mode of production to transform all production as much as possible into commodity production. The mainspring by which this is accomplished is precisely the involvement of all production into the capitalist circulation process. And developed commodity production itself is capitalist commodity production." End quote. Differentiating between commodity production and its developed capitalist counterpart. Lenin in Chapter 4 of his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, says the same. Quote, "Capitalism is commodity production at its highest stage of development, when labor power itself becomes a commodity." End quote. But by overemphasizing this, Marxist-Leninists lose the track of the crux of the issue, that commodity production has become too fused to capitalism to simply be torn from it, like a crying baby is torn from its mother. Lenin also affirms Marx's analysis with respect to commodity production and its dependence on the social division of labor. In 1899, he wrote, quote, "The basis of commodity economy is the social division of labor. Manufacturing industry separates from the raw material industry, and each of these subdivides into small varieties and subvarieties which produce specific products as commodities, and exchange them for the products of all the others. Thus, the development of commodity economy leads to an increase in the number of separate and independent branches of industry. Thus, the social division of labor is the basis of the entire process of development of commodity economy and of capitalism." End quote. In the introduction of Socialism or Exposure of Plunder of the State, Lenin states, quote, "When capitalists work for their defense, i.e., for the state, it is obviously no longer pure capitalism, but a special form of national economy. Pure capitalism means commodity production, and commodity production means working for an unknown and free market. But the capitalist working for defense does not work for the market at all. He works on government orders, very often with money loaned by the state." End quote. Lenin agrees with Marx that commodity production is just pure capitalism, and its generalized form serves as the basis of bourgeois society. And he adds that, quote, "Commodity production means work for an unknown and free market," end quote. Which means that commodity production presupposes not only the social division of labor, but markets too, and all of these are interconnected. Taken apart, they don't really mean anything separately. And any socialist society that has markets, profits, commodity production, and such categories belongs to a very dubious school of socialism. Hakim also makes the following argument in his video, quote, "Some people argue that since certain goods, i.e. consumer goods distributed by the state in shops, are exchanged through money, this too is a component of commodity production. I tend to disagree with this point, as money functions and historically functioned differently under socialism." End quote. Leaving the latter part aside, which is but an ahistorical description of the Soviet ruble, with which we will not be dealing right now, let's explore the relationship of money and commodity production. In Capital Volume 2, Marx explains this in great detail. Quote, "As to the first point, commodity production presupposes commodity circulation, and commodity circulation presupposes the expression of commodities in money, the circulation of money. The splitting of commodity into commodity and money is the law of the expression of the products as a commodity." End quote. This is affirmed by Rosa Luxemburg, writing in Chapter 5 of The Accumulation of Capital, a rather controversial work, but an important one nevertheless. Quote, "The general form of capitalist production is that of commodity production, which implies the circulation of money. Secondly, the circulation of capital is based upon the continuous alteration of three forms of capital: money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital." End quote. Hakim's argument is based on his impression that Soviet money perhaps represented some form of labor vouchers, or at least didn't function like the usual currency does. To be certain, Hakim isn't making any of this up. He is simply regurgitating talking points from 1950s. The historicity of this claim aside, juxtaposed to Stalin's opinions on money in the Soviet Union, it is a one-to-one reflection. Quote, "Once there is commodity circulation, there must be money. In the capitalist countries, the monetary economy, including the banks, leads to the ruination of workers, and impoverishment of the population and increase in the wealth of the exploiters. Money and the banks serve as means of exploitation under capitalism. Our monetary economy is not the usual one and is distinct from the capitalist monetary economy. With us, money and the money economy serve to strengthen the socialist economy. With us, the monetary economy is an instrument that we are using in the interests of socialism." End quote. Tadayuki Tsushima, a Japanese Marxist, analyzed Stalin's comments and works in 1956 in, quote, "The Law of Value and Socialism," end quote, and had a few words to say, a part of which is also about money. A little biographic. Tsushima started out as an anarchist in his early youth, and after being converted to communism by the leader of the Japanese Communist Party, he slowly grew disillusioned with its status theory, leading him to start exploring Trotskyism. Throughout his intellectual career, he became increasingly critical of Trotskyism, especially Orthodox Trotskyism, ending up to something similar of a Leninist humanist. Back on track. Tsushima starts off very cynically, saying that if Stalin had truly, quote, "digested well capital so that it was in his blood and bones," end quote, he would have acknowledged that the law of value would have already disappeared if it were the first stage of communism, without the need to wait for the higher one, a deduction of which would be that the Soviet Union was not socialist at all. He continues, quote, "The basis for saying this is Marx's theory of value, according to which a communistic social structure whether in the first or the second stage, is premised on labor that has become directly social labor, which is to say, a form of production that is diametrically opposed to commodity production, so that the law of value withers away, and this law of value only arises under the opposite case. This question has no room for any sort of scholastic philosophy to be introduced and is instead perfectly clear. Stalin and the Stalinists have rejected this pillar of Marxist political economy, both theoretically and practically. End quote. Tsushima bases his claim that a socialist society, regardless of the stage, has no commodity production and no law of value on the fact that, according to Marx, once labor has become directly social, a characteristic of a communist social structure, the possibility of commodity production existing is none, as it is diametrically opposed to the existence of directly social labor. He continues with the analysis of money, and takes a wonderful example of a contemporary falsifier in Japan. Quote, in Japan, a blatant example of this can be seen in the following ramblings of a quote-unquote Marxist named Toshio Hirodate. If his statement is taken at face value, Hirodate must be considered a quote-unquote Marxist, who lacks the gumption of the Russians who rejected Marx and Engels. In a June 1949 article that appeared in the journal Hieron, he writes, quote, many of the things written by Marx and Engels indicate that they rejected the need for the operation of the law of value and money and commerce in a socialist society, end quote. Written by Sam Gazarov. Then Hirodate replies, Marx and Engels only said that there is no need for capitalistic commerce or money in a socialist society, but he never said that about socialistic commerce or socialistic money. In this manner, Gazarov is misinterpreting Marx. As Gazarov himself notes, when reading Marx's sentences, one must distinguish between the letter and the essence. This is such a beautiful example of how the Stalinist mindset works, that only a few others can trumpet. The twisting of the words, the rhetorical mumbo-jumbo, and the outright falsification, it being tragic aside, is actually quite impressive. Adding socialist in front of any capitalist notion apparently turns it into a socialist one, with the magic of dialectics, or whatever technical term they're in the mood to exploit. Tsushima comments on Hirodate's quote, theory unquote, with vitriol. Quote, one must distinguish between the letter and the essence. Is that so? What would Marx have to say about this variety of Marxist? No doubt he would say, I'm no Marxist. Marx laughed caustically at the followers of Proudhon who sought to shake free of the hell of money on the basis of commodity production. And yet here, conversely, quote, socialist commerce and socialist money, end quote, are being dragged into socialism, which is a society of communal labor. In either case, we are dealing with terrible idiots. Under socialism, the category of commodity value, and therefore all commerce and all money, wither away. This is the necessary corollary of Marx's theory of value, and this is also what Marx and Engels themselves spoke of. They clearly stated that labor certificates do not become money. It is ridiculous to say that Marx never said anything about this. Hirodate is not thinking straight. I would like to ask him whether money and commerce are possible without the law of value, or we could ask him whether it is possible for the law of value to arise when labor has become directly social. If it is said that it could arise, this is the view of commodity production as something super-historical, which would mean that Marx's labor theory of value in capital is mistaken. End quote. Side note, Hakim also says in the very same sentence that, quote, money functions differently under socialism, end quote, without any elaboration whatsoever. So we must here state that money doesn't exist under socialism at all. Labor vouchers are simply a different kind of money. They differ from money greatly, especially from its modern type. For example, labor vouchers cannot be kept in a reserve and be accumulated. Any attempt at this leads to the loss of the performed labor quantum without any compensation. Anyways, Tsushima's brilliant exposition, marked by his analysis of Stalinist contemporaries, gives us a lot to think about. Historically, we see that Stalin's theory found opposition not only in the Soviet Union, but worldwide. So, from Japan, let's go to Italy and see what Amedeo Bordiga, the dreaded Neapolitan, had to say about Stalin's 1952 work in his famous Dialogue with Stalin. First, Bordiga affirms that, quote, if Stalin had spoken of a system of commodity production after the conquest of power by the proletariat, this would not have been a monstrosity, end quote. As we know from revolutionary history, Lenin was conscious of the fact that the Soviet system had maintained commodity production and hence capitalism due to its various reasons, be it war communism and the following measures of NEP, or the general hard conditions and need for such measures. But Lenin consciously repeated over and over again that this was not socialism. He repeats this again in The Tax and Kind, something which we'll discuss later. Bordiga has his own thoughts on why commodity production henceforth belongs to the capitalist category. Stalin's major point in his work was that commodity production predates capitalism and doesn't mean capitalism, as well as not leading to it always, which is true, and Bordiga agrees to this, but remarks that Marx develops this precise theory, the theory that Stalin makes the methodological appropriation of, for quite a different aim. Briefly, Marx was criticizing the bourgeois economists who considered commodity production natural, permanent, and eternal, and regarded it as a vital mechanism to combine production and consumption. Bordiga makes a very important point that after commodity production has become universal as the capitalist system spreads, the former must necessarily go down with the latter. We can refer to Marx's comments in his draft of Capital Chapter 6 to confirm this, but as we've already discussed that, we shall move on. Bordiga then asserts that Stalin's claims about the benevolency of Soviet commodity production, that it isn't exploitative or capitalist if there is no private ownership, which is a rather historical claim, is completely absurd, as the existence of mass commodities indicate that somewhere along the way, reserveless proletarians had to sell their labor power. Hakim in his video distinguishes between ownership by the whole people and collective ownership. Of course, Bordiga addresses this too, in a section subtitled The Russian Economy. I don't want this part of the video to become too inflated and just be devoted to discussing one man, so we shall move on, but I urge everyone to read this piece and draw conclusions themselves. We will conclude Bordiga's analysis with his comments on the law of value, for which he cites anti-Düring, in which Engels says, quote, "The exchange of labor for labor on the principle of equal valuation, insofar as it has any meaning, that is to say, the mutual exchangeability of products of equal social labor, hence the law of value, is the fundamental law of precisely commodity production, hence also of its highest form, capitalist production. Düring wants to abolish the abuses which have arisen out of the development of commodity production into capitalist production, by giving effect against them to the basic law of commodity production, precisely the law of whose operation these abuses are due. Like him, he wants to abolish the real consequences of the law of value by means of fantastic ones." End quote. Engels makes sufficiently clear that as commodity production was devoured by capitalism and gave rise to its abuses, they became inseparable, and any attempt to tackle capitalism backwards, i.e., try to neutralize commodity production in a Proudhonian manner, was simply setting out for a task that is impossible to complete. Bordiga, upon quoting this part in the text, wraps his discussion up a bit later with the following. Quote, "In socialism, not only compulsory work is necessary, but also recording of the performed labor time and its certificate, the famous labor voucher, so much discussed in the last century. The peculiarity of this certificate is that it cannot be kept in a reserve, so that any try to accumulate it leads to the loss of performed labor quantum without any compensation. The law of value is buried." Engels. Hence, on the assumptions we made above, society will not assign values to products. End quote. Empirically, Bordiga asserts a few conclusions can be drawn. As the law of value prevails in the Soviet domestic market, the products have commodity character, making the existence of a market necessary. If the market exists, and the exchange takes place according to the law of value, so, between equivalents, the monetary expression is also needed, debunking any flimsy claims that the Russian ruble functioned anything like a labor voucher. So, while we see the errors of Stalin's theory clearly, where did it begin? Where does it have its roots? Well, the answers might surprise you. First, it needs to be remarked that these bodies of thought, just like any other, didn't appear from thin air. Both Paul Matic and Paresh Chattopadhyay take note that much of the later emerging theories of socialist commodity production and socialist law of value lay with Karl Kautsky, the pope of Marxism and the uncrowned leader of the collapsing Second International. Kautsky, writing in his last work, laid out the schemata of a revisionist opportunist ideology, likes of which we have rarely seen before. Quote, "People love today to speak disdainfully about the liberalistic economy. However, the theories founded by Kwasny, Adam Smith, and Ricardo are not at all obsolete. In their essentials, Marx had accepted their theories and developed them further, and he has never denied that the liberal freedom of commodity production constituted the best basis of its development. Marx distinguishes himself from the classicists therein, that, when the latter saw in commodity production of private producers the only possible form of production, Marx saw the highest form of commodity production, leading through its own development to conditions allowing for a still better form of production, social production, where society, identical with the whole of the working population, controls the means of production, producing no longer for profit, but to satisfy needs. The socialist mode of production has its own rules, in many respects different from the laws of commodity production. However, as long as commodity production prevails, it will best function if those laws of motion discovered in the era of liberalism are respected. End quote. Paul Matic, in his 1939 work, Karl Kautsky From Marx to Hitler, very ironically remarks that it is quite surprising that someone who had edited the fourth volume of Marx's Capital made such errors. But he follows this up by saying that as a talented student, Kautsky wasn't alien to making it work. He was willing to fit Marxism in his own, limited frames to match his theories and a flawed understanding of social development, which was a recurring theme in the Second International. Just like Stalin, Kautsky considered Marx's value concept as a law of socialist economics, if applied consciously, justly, and utilized very carefully, as not to be left to the blind operations of the market and cause crises and suffering. But upon this verdict, Kautsky was scolded by Engels himself, and he pointed out to him that, quote, for Marx, value is a strictly historical category, that neither before nor after capitalism did there exist or could there exist a value production which differed only in form from that of capitalism. End quote. Kautsky accepted this as seen in his 1887 work The Economic Doctrines of Karl Marx, in which he correctly identified many of his mistakes. Unfortunately, this only lasted exactly 35 years, for in 1922, while writing The Proletarian Revolution in his program, Kautsky reintroduced commodity production, the value concept, and market money economy in his vision of a socialist society. Paresh Chattopadhyay joins Matic in exploring Kautsky's proto-Stalinist theories, writing about Kautsky's concept of socialist money, socialist wage labor, and socialist markets in his magnificent book, Socialism and Commodity Production. This work offers much more than my video, and I urge every single one of you to check it out before forming your opinions. Naturally, it is in detail and doesn't lack the technical aspect. Unfortunately, I cannot showcase examples from it here, as that would add many, many more minutes onto the video, and I am determined to keep it as crisp as I can. Raya Dunayevskaya, an outstanding Marxist of the 20th century, belonging to the humanist school, also had a few words to say on Stalinist falsification. Her trial to analyze contemporary Soviet Union and how it perverted Marxist theories to suit its own agendas is best exemplified by her three works. The 1944 Can the Law of Value be Uprooted? The 1945 Revision or Reaffirmation of Marxism, and the 1948 Stalinists Falsify Marxism Anew. And we shall look into all of these briefly, as they offer valuable context. Leontiev went on to propose beginning the teaching of Marxist Capital by skipping Chapter 1 on commodities, marking a deadly start, this time fully public, of Soviet falsification. In the first work, Dunayevskaya presents a scathing criticism of the notion of socialist law of value. During this time, Dunayevskaya wasn't a humanist yet. That would still be a few years away, so this is only a drop in the sea of her magnificent works. Quote, Marx called the labor process of capital the process of alienation. Abstract labor is alienated labor, labor estranged not merely from the product of its toil, but also in regard to the very process of expenditure of its labor power. Once in the process of production, the labor power of the worker becomes as much a component part of capital as fixed machinery or constant capital, which is again the worker's materialized labor. According to Marx, Ricardo quote sees only the quantitative determination of exchange value, that is, that it is equal to the definitive quantity of labor time, but he forgets the qualitative determination, that the individual labor must be means of its alienation be present in the form of abstract universal social labor. In its Marxian interpretation, therefore, the law of value entails the use of concept of alienated or exploited labor and, as a consequence, the concept of surplus value. End quote. Dunayevskaya showcased that for the law of value to exist, there must necessarily be alienated labor and surplus value, which are not possible without exploitation, something that Stalin says is no longer present in the USSR, making his statement not only historically, but also theoretically inaccurate and contradictory. She takes note of the fact that in 1935, the very same Leontiev had written very differently on the topic. Quote, the Marxian doctrine of surplus value is based, as we have seen, on his teaching of value. That is why it is important to keep the teaching of value free from all distortions, because the theory of exploitation is built on it. It is perfectly clear that this division of labor into concrete and abstract labor exists only in commodity production. This dual nature of labor reveals the basic contradiction of commodity production. End quote. Thus we see that Soviet economists were very aware of the exploitative nature of commodity production, but as the official narrative shifted later on, they had no choice but to play along. In the same work, Dunayevskaya discusses the effects of this change and how it was done. But we shall not continue with it any longer, as the following works discuss this in a better way. In 1945, Dunayevskaya returned to the topic with even more brutality and this time set out to expose her quote-unquote critics. This work is more crucial than ever, as it details how quotations from Capital can be taken out of context to knit together an agenda. Of course, her 1943 piece hadn't gone unnoticed, and several people had made responses, among which the most notable were Professors Lange and Rogin, and one Mr. Brown. They challenged Dunayevskaya's notion that the law of value couldn't operate in a socialist society. To this, she responded with the following, quote, Marx castigates, quote, the presupposition that the theory of value developed for the explanation of bourgeois society has validity for the socialist state of Marx, end quote. He reiterated time and time again that, quote, in his analysis of value, I had in view the bourgeois relations and not an application of this theory of value to a socialist state, end quote. In Anti-Düring, Engels stated that in a socialist society, quote, people will be able to manage everything very simply without the intervention of the famous value, end quote. In contrast to Marx and Engels, Lange not only asserts that the law of value applies to a socialist society, but further stretches this meaning of the law of value by saying that in its pure form, Marx considered it applicable only under conditions of simple commodity production. In reality, Marx criticized Adam Smith just for that assertion. Smith, he explains, fell into the error because he had, quote, abstracted the law of value from capitalistic production, and precisely because of this, it appears as if it were invalid, end quote. Starting with the labor theory of value of Smith-Ricardo, he showed that the unequal exchange between the capitalist and the worker was not a deviation from the law, but its very basis. He transformed the classical labor theory of value into theory of surplus value. Value, he wrote, was a social relation of production, specifically capitalistic. Marx's theory of value is his theory of surplus value, end quote. Here, Dunayevskaya affirmed that in his analysis of value, Marx, quote, had in view bourgeois relations and not an application of this theory of value to a socialist state, end quote. This refutes the transcendental character of the law of value, which Smith had, in his mind, demonstrated almost 2 centuries ago. But Marx severely criticized Smith for trying to abstract the law of value from capitalist production, and Engels agreed that in a socialist society, the quote-unquote famous value wouldn't interfere with, for example, management. The 1948 Stalinist falsify Marxism anew, the state of teaching in the Soviet Union, is the last of the trio, but also the longest and most detailed exposition of Soviet falsification. We won't be getting into much detail here, as the piece is a bit more complicated to condense. However, I urge all of you to read it on your own. It goes step by step, reviewing the history of how these falsifications came into existence, who is responsible for them, what methodology is used, and how it's wrong. The same Leontiev we talked about is taken as the prime example here too, and halfway through the text, Dunayevskaya concludes that, quote, Leontiev's tortuous attempts to resolve the irresolvable contradiction between his admission that labor in the Soviet Union hears a dual character and his claim that all capitalist relations have been eradicated has ended, of necessity, in his abandonment of the Marxist analysis of the dual character of labor, end quote. Leontiev, trying to reconcile the Stalinist narrative to the long history of Marxist opposition to the socialist law of value, remarks that neither Marx, Engels, or even Lenin could foresee the, quote, practical way to employ the law of value in the interest of socialism, end quote. He continues that only, quote, the genius of Stalin, end quote, can contextualize this topic in a true Marxist fashion, concluding that this has opened a new stage of, quote, Marxist-Leninist economics, end quote. And by new, he of course meant the false doctrine concocted in Moscow by Stalin and his henchmen. Lenin also had quite a few things to say about commodity production, and before discussing Hakim's misquotation of Lenin's The Tax in Kind, we are compelled to discuss Lenin's attitudes throughout the years beforehand. We discussed some relevant passages from Lenin's work with respect to commodity production and its character earlier in the video as well, and for a fuller picture, one could refer to this part as a continuation of that. In 1902, writing in, quote, material for the preparation of the program of the RSDLP, notes on Plekhanov's first draft program, end quote, Lenin doesn't fail to mention commodity production. In his 18th note, Lenin criticizes Plekhanov's following thesis, quote, that the yoke of economic dependence, which lies on its, the worker's shoulders, can be thrown off only through its own efforts, and that to throw off this yoke a social revolution is necessary, i.e., the destruction of the capitalist production relations and the conversion of the means of production and of the circulation of products into public property, end quote. Countering it with the following note of his own, quote, destruction of capitalist production relations, socialist production taking the place of commodity production, the expropriation of the exploiters, the conversion of the means of production into public property, the conversion of private into public property, end quote. Here, especially in the first part of the note, where Lenin clarifies what destroying the capitalist production relations entails, he not only excludes commodity production from socialist production, but he very explicitly states that socialist production must take the place of commodity production. Therefore, in Lenin's mind, and in the mind of most Bolsheviks at that time, commodity production had nothing to do with socialism, and was very directly excluded from its existence. He doesn't talk of generalized commodity production or capitalist commodity production, but commodity production itself. We affirmed this by looking at the draft program of Lenin himself, which, for its very first thesis, takes, quote, commodity production is ever more rapidly developing in Russia, the capitalist mode of production becoming increasingly dominant in it, end quote, which shows that in this whole context, commodity production is spoken of as commodity production itself, without any descriptors such as simple or capitalist. In 1914, writing in the Left Narodniks, Lenin talks about the process of what we can basically deem, quote, the absorption of commodity production by capitalism, end quote. He describes it thus, quote, in a society in which commodity production prevails, every small farmer is inevitably and increasingly drawn into the sphere of exchange and becomes increasingly dependent on the market, not only the local and national, but the world market as well. Millions and millions of phenomena observed day by day prove that production for exchange, commodity production, capitalism are growing in all parts of the world, and all countries without exception. That production for exchange and simple commodity production are evolving into capitalism is another phenomenon confirmed by millions and millions of daily economic observations in every village, in every trade, and in every handicraft, end quote. Here, Lenin clarifies that whatever the character of commodity production, it inevitably evolves into capitalism, and that this is empirically observed very easily. Yet, we can find the most concise criticism of Stalin, even though it was not directed at him in the original text, in Lenin himself. Writing in the 4th chapter of his critical remarks on the national question, Lenin writes the following, quote, such an idea, applied to the national question, resembles Proudhon's idea as applied to capitalism, not abolishing capitalism and its basis, commodity production, but purging that basis of abuses, of excrescencies, and so forth, not abolishing exchange and exchange value, but on the contrary, making it constitutional, universal, absolute, fair, and free of fluctuations, crises, and abuses. Such was Proudhon's idea. Just as Proudhon was petty bourgeois, and his theory converted exchange and commodity production into an absolute category, and exalted them as the acme of perfection, so is the theory and program of cultural national autonomy petty bourgeois, for it converts bourgeois nationalism into an absolute category, exalts it as the acme of perfection, and purges it of violence, injustice, etc. End quote. This is one of the most valuable paragraphs Lenin has written on the topic, as it demonstrates that trying to purge capitalism and its foundation, commodity production, was nothing but petty bourgeois thinking, with an unachievable goal. So long commodity production exists and isn't replaced by production directly for use by direct social labor under a wholly different mode of production, your realities only change superstructurally. As Stalin admitted in his 1952 work, commodity production did indeed exist and the law of value operated too in the Soviet Union, as well as profit, accumulation, and other various categories usual to capitalism, the latter admission coming from his discussion with Soviet economists. However, throughout all this time, Stalin justified it with them being socialist, or put to good use, or filtered and utilized differently than in capitalist countries. All of these comments now seem nonsensical, rhetorical mishmash of poor justifications, once Lenin has revealed the key to Proudhon's mistake. Stalin was precisely trying to demonstrate how under the Soviet system these categories were different and better. Quote, A certain amount of profit is needed by us. Without profit, we cannot create reserves, have accumulation, support fulfillment of defense tasks, and satisfy social needs. Here we can see that there is labor for oneself and labor for society. The word profit itself has become very dirty. It would be good to have some other concept, but what? Perhaps net income? Under the category of profit, we have hidden an altogether different content. We do not have spontaneous capital flow and no law of competition. We do not have capitalist law of maximum profit, nor the law of average profit. But without profit, it is not possible to develop our economy. For our enterprises, even minimal profits are adequate, and sometimes they can work without profits on account of profits of other enterprises. We ourselves distribute our resources. Under capitalism, only profitable enterprises can exist. In our system, we have very profitable, somewhat profitable, and totally unprofitable enterprises. During the first years, our heavy industry did not produce any profit, but started to do so later on. End quote. Or, quote, money and banks serve as means of exploitation under capitalism, but our monetary economy is not the usual one and is distinct from the capitalist monetary economy. With us, money and the money economy serve to strengthen the socialist economy. End quote. Here, it's made clear how Stalin's approach to capitalist categories was Proudhonian. He believed that, partially due to apparent necessity, such categories had to exist and be utilized. But they were not like the capitalist ones, which in Stalin's mind meant that they were free from exploitation and were just, serving the people. So he precisely argued that they were free from, quote, abuses of excrescencies, end quote, to quote Lenin, who considered the abolition of exchange and exchange value a necessity, as reforming them just to be not bad is not possible. Now we arrive at the tax in kind, which Hakim utilizes dishonestly, or maybe it was an honest mistake, but nevertheless he deduces incorrect conclusions from it. He says, quote, the existence of numerous modes of production can be present at one time, or different times within a single nation, as Lenin illustrated in the aforementioned essay. This is not correct. Not because such a thing is impossible, Lenin demonstrates that in Soviet Russia, state capitalism, socialism, etc. prevailed at the same time, but because it ignores how Lenin prefaced this exposition. Quote, no one, I think, in studying the question of the economic system of Russia, has denied its transitional character, nor, I think, has any communist denied that the term Soviet Socialist Republics implies the determination of the Soviet power to achieve the transition to socialism, and not that the existing economic system is recognized as a socialist order. End quote. Now, the point Hakim was trying to make is a little unclear, but whatever it was, the claim that different modes of production can coexist is true. However, it is still capitalism. Just because there are traces of nascent communism doesn't make this order not capitalist, as demonstrated by Lenin above. And I'm positive Hakim was not trying to imply that due to this, past quote-unquote socialist projects were capitalist. Nevertheless, both of these things are in quotations from Lenin's 1918 pamphlet, upon which he expands and builds on in The Tax and Kind. After finishing to quote his previous work, Lenin still implies that even 3 years later, the capitalist system prevailed. He says, quote, the tax in kind is one of the forms of transition from that peculiar war communism which was forced on us by extreme want, ruin, and war, to regular socialist exchange of products, end quote. Meaning that he distinguished even the present order, that of 1921, a transitional period, which was meant to lead to a regular socialist exchange of products, which means that this socialist order has not yet been achieved. He continues, quote, the latter, in its turn, is one of the forms of transition from socialism, with the peculiar features due to the predominantly small peasant population to communism. That the small peasant quote-unquote structure, partially patriarchal, partially petty bourgeois, predominates in a small peasant country is self-evident. It is an inconceivable truth, elementary to political economy, which even the layman's everyday experience will confirm, that once you have exchange, the small economy is bound to develop the petty bourgeois capitalist way, end quote. Now, this extract is not only important in understanding why Lenin considered Soviet Russia a non-socialist order, but also to analyze why the revolution wound up the way it did. As he admits, upon the introduction of exchange, the small economy will develop the petty bourgeois capitalist way, making such a formation inevitable unless fought against actively. He ends on a high note. Exchange is freedom of trade. It is capitalism. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how the concept of labor division and its role in commodity production is an important part of our analysis. We will talk about this very briefly. The first point of order is to realize that capitalism not only enslaves and exploits those who work under it, but also dehumanizes and robs the members of the ruling classes of their human semblance as well, making humanity as a whole completely subservient to it. Quote, and not only the laborers, but also the classes directly or indirectly exploiting the laborers are made subject, through the division of labor, to the tool of their function. The empty-minded bourgeoisie to their own capital and his own insane cravings for profit. The lawyer to his fossilized legal conceptions, which dominates him as an independent power. The educated classes in general to their manifold species of local narrow-mindedness and one-sidedness, to their physical and mental short-sightedness, to their stunted growth due to their narrow specialized education and their being chained for life to this specialized activity, even when this specialized activity is merely to do nothing." End quote. The division of labor, while advantageous to some degree, plays a fundamental role in alienated labor. In his 1844 manuscripts, Marx described this process in great detail. Quote, the accumulation of capital increases the division of labor, and the division of labor increases the number of workers. Conversely, the number of workers increases the division of labor, just as the division of labor increases the accumulation of capital. With this division of labor on one hand and the accumulation of capital on the other, the worker becomes ever more exclusively dependent on labor, and on a particular very one-sided machine-like labor at that. Just as he is thus depressed spiritually and physically to the condition of a machine, and from being a man becomes an abstract activity in the belly, so he also becomes ever more dependent on every fluctuation in market price, on the application of capital, and on the whim of the rich. Equally, the increase in the class of people wholly dependent on work intensifies competition among the workers, thus lowering their price. In the factory system, the situation of the worker reaches its climax. End quote. Humanistic in his approach, Marx observes the links between the division of labor and capital accumulation, both of which drive each other more and more immensely. This causes the worker to be increasingly dependent on labor alone, turning him into a machine-like entity. All of this, of course, describes the process of alienation. There isn't much to be expanded on here. The division of labor has existed for as long as labor has, albeit in vastly different forms. Communism would transcend this phenomena, as Engels said in the Principles of Communism. Quote, the division of society into different, mutually hostile classes will then become unnecessary. Indeed, it will not be only unnecessary, but intolerable in the new social order. The existence of classes originated in the division of labor, and the division of labor, as it has been known up to the present, will completely disappear. End quote. The division of labor, once a natural occurrence, was torn apart and molded into organized, industrial division of labor, completely estranged from the producers. As the division of labor becomes voluntary, humanity is compelled to move away from necessity and enter freedom. But Stalin's USSR had the division of labor. Quote, it is necessary, in the third place, to ensure such a cultural advancement of society as will secure for all members of society the all-round development of their physical and mental abilities, so that the members of society may be in a position to receive an education sufficient to enable them to be active agents of social development, and in a position freely to choose their occupations and not be tied all their lives, owing to the existing division of labor, to some one occupation. End quote. The USSR also had profit, capital accumulation, commodity production, and all such categories. So it's difficult to follow Stalin's analysis on how the Soviet Union was free from exploitation and misery. The fact that all of these cannot be abolished at a stroke is completely irrelevant here. We are all well aware of this. Our problem precisely lies with passing this off as a socialist order, instead of carrying out an honest analysis, culminating in the admittance of the Soviet Union being capitalist. I also wanted very briefly to look into the 7th chapter of, quote, the Marxian concept of capital and the Soviet experience, end quote, also a book by Paresh Chattopadhyay, which takes notice of the very interesting trend, common in non-capitalist circles, to juxtapose market anarchy and central planning and use them almost synonymously with capitalism and socialism. The reason why I thought including it would be appropriate is that many Marxist-Leninists tend to hold such opinions. They believe that nationalization, collectivization, central command of the economy and such is the signifier of socialism, even though this can easily be dispelled by Engels' anti-Düring. Discussing this would also completely debunk Stalin's thesis that in the USSR there is no, quote, spontaneous capital flow and no law of competition, end quote, which makes profit in similar categories socialist. Chattopadhyay also addresses the guaranteed employment from the state and similar arguments Hakim made in his video. Unfortunately, this would add another 10 minutes or so to the video, so I will leave it aside for now. As we near the end of this video, I also want to address something Hakim doesn't fail to mention, as it's a common argument used by Marxist-Leninists. Quote, commodity production is not a button you press to switch off, or it was necessary due to the material conditions, end quote. Actually, you will not find many people, including me, contesting this. What we do contest is calling this socialism. Lenin too acknowledged the need to utilize capitalism, especially in the taxing kind, but didn't fail to mention that this was not socialism. That is precisely what Marxist-Leninists lack, and what we affirm time and time again. Our criticism doesn't revolve around how Stalin exploited rhetoric or how he wrote ahistorical expositions. Lenin had maintained capitalism during the course of the revolution, as a sudden leap into socialism cannot be made. But he repeated over and over again, with honesty of analysis and clarity of rhetoric, that these categories were capitalistic, necessary, and unavoidable, for reasons such and such. He never once pretended to be doing socialism or lied to his own people about the conditions they were being led to. This is why many anti-Stalinist Marxists have a great deal of respect for Lenin, and why there exist anti-Stalinist Leninist tendencies as exemplified by the ultra-Leninist Bordiga. As Tsushima says, quote, Stalin should have acknowledged that if the law of value had not withered away, a society is far from being socialist, end quote. Had he done this, he would have been no different from the great revolutionaries of his age, the ones like Lenin and Luxemburg. But he chose to publicly, consciously, and shamelessly falsify Marxism to suit his own agendas, and this merits no respect, ignoring all of the other problematic sides of Stalin. One final thing before we wrap up for good. In the introduction, I mentioned how Stalinist arguments, quote, usually include out-of-context passages from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, end quote, and the repetition of birthmarks of capitalism ad nauseum. I want to expand on this a little bit, once again with the help of our faithful comrade Tsushima. In the very same piece we spoke of earlier, he clarifies the birthmarks of the Old Society section of the critique of the Gotha program. He inquires if the birthmarks of the Old Society remaining in the distribution relations of socialist society mean that abstract human labor remains as the substance of value and that the law of value remains. Of course, as any sane Marxist would, he answers this in the negative. He even mentions that some people have tried to, quote, show that the Boogaloo example of a transfigured law of value is such a case, end quote. But not only Tsushima, we can too ourselves deduct that this is nothing but silliness. He then quotes the following part of Marx's critique of the Gotha program. Quote, here, in the distribution relations in socialism based on the equal exchange of labor, obviously the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is exchange of equal values. Content and form are changed because under the altered circumstances no one can give anything except as labor, and because on the other hand nothing can pass to the ownership of the individuals, except individual means of consumption. But as far as the distribution of the latter among the individual producers is concerned, the same principle prevails as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. A given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form. End quote. Tsushima explains that in the exchange of equal labor within socialistic distribution relations, the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is exchange of equal values. He finishes off with, quote, in the world of commodities, abstract human labor is the substance of value, the measure of its intrinsic value. The magnitude of value is gauged by the quantity of this labor, and the quantity of the labor itself is measured by the continuous period of time during which it is carried out. As long as commodity exchange is the exchange of equal values, included within this exchange are equal quantities of social labor. In the case of the distribution relations within socialism, i.e., relations where the producer, quote, receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such amount of labor, and with this certificate he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost, end quote, so that the, quote, same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form he has received in another form, end quote. The same principle as the case of the exchange of commodities of equal values applies. In other words, equal quantities of labor are exchanged. The labor exchange in this case is abstract human labor and could not be the measure of exchange otherwise. Here, abstraction is carried out as a social action, which is why Marx speaks of the same principle prevailing. End quote. Tsushima is being perfectly clear and warrants no commentary here. And with this, I think we're done. Hakim tried to reiterate Stalin's arguments of why commodity production exists under socialism, but as we've shown above, and pretty extensively so, this is not quite true. In his video, Hakim says some correct things, but when it comes to the controversial stuff he tends to talk with half-truths, which can be worse than lies as they are masked as facts and can easily deceive an inexperienced listener. In any case, I want to thank everyone who watched this video, and everyone who helped, especially this person right here. I hope my point was sufficiently clear, and even if you're not convinced, Now you have plenty of materials and reference points to go do your own research and explore this part of Marxism independently. There will probably be angry Marxist-Leninists saying I strawmanned Stalin, or misinterpreted Lenin, or never read Marx, but that's alright. I only wanted to get my position across to you guys, so you can independently decide who's right and who's wrong. Goodbye.